I've got a great guest for you today, Barry Walsh. Yeah, he laughs, but it's wonderful. Also known as Buffalo Barry, right? How the heck did you get that moniker? I mean, you did it purposely. Sure.
I did do it, yeah. Well, Buffalo Bob, Howdy Doody.
Yeah.
Buffalo Bill.
Yeah. Those are all old-time Western folks for those that don't know who those are.
And as you'll hear more, I've been a suicidologist for many years, and my work in my main career has been pretty heavy. So when I decided to start my Indian art business, I wanted to not take it too seriously. Mm-hmm. So I gave it a somewhat silly name.
Yeah.
But now everybody on the Hopi reservation that I've been going to for 30 years, they all call me Buffalo, so it's kind of stuck.
And now you're the white buffalo, right?
Yeah,
Which is sacred.
As nicknames go, it's not that bad.
Yeah, no,
yeah, Buffalo. I kind of like it.
Well, you know, I get it. I was a physician, and I thought, well, I'll make it Medicine Man Gallery, because people are, if they don't know anything else, they'll remember I'm a doctor.
Right.
And now most people don't know that, but
right.
I am, actually.
Right.
So you're a suicidologist.
Suicidologist, yeah. That's what I've been.
And you have a PhD, right?
I do.
So I'm going to get to that point, because I want to kind of find out how Buffalo Barry got to my chair, suicidologist, and was one of the leader in our field, and really Kachina dolls. That's your real interest, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So where did you grow up, Barry?
I grew up in New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, eh?
Yes.
And did you go like primary, the whole thing, the whole whack through New Hampshire?
I went to high school in Massachusetts, and then I went to college initially in Maine.
And so when you're growing up there, did you have interest in art as a kid?
No.
Nothing. What was your interest?
Just being a kid, playing baseball, tennis, being outdoors. I had no interest in Indian art.
And so
I had no exposure to Indian art.
Yeah, because you're in New Hampshire.
Right.
But at that point in time, what did you think you wanted to do when you're going like from high school? When you left high school and you obviously went to college and beyond, but so
right.
what were you thinking?
When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a archaeologist or something like that. When I hit college, I thought I'd be a history teacher. But then when I got out of college, I took my first job working with addicts and alcoholics. Because it was a hippie time and everybody wanted to help everybody else, which was a good thing.
Yeah, so what year was that? What year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from college in 1969.
Yeah, so
Bowdoin College in Maine.
And because you were in school, you got a deferment and you didn't have to go down that line of
I had
Vietnam.
and have asthma.
Yeah.
Which resulted in me being 1Y, as it was called back then. Yeah, so I didn't have to go to Vietnam like some of my friends.
Yeah. And so you were and what was that like? You're in Massachusetts, right? So what was the scene and the college scene like that at that time? Because that's the Vietnam War. It's Tet Offensive 68. It's really, it's a different world. People don't realize how crazy it was in certain places in America.
It was tumultuous.
Yeah.
It was intense. It was inspiring. The music scene was incredible. There was a lot of substance use, which I fortunately never got sucked into that too much. But some of it was very extreme. For some people, they ended up dead because of that.
Yeah. And did you see, was that part of the whole psychology that pushed you to go, hey, maybe I want to go deeper into the human nature of, because what you end up doing is pretty extreme in the medical profession.
I came to Boston, roomed with a former college roommate, and thought I wanted to help people. Looked around for ads, found a hospital in Boston that was serving addicts and alcoholics, and went there, worked for 2 years, then went back and got my master's.
And so so you worked with addicts when you were in college still? You're like a junior?
No. I worked with addicts after I graduated.
You graduated.
I was 21.
Yeah, okay, so you were just a kid.
I was.
Yeah, and what was that like working with addicts, at that point in time? Because most of these were your peers, right? A lot of them were. Well,
it was also a place that served alcoholics, so there were a lot of middle-aged or even elderly alcoholics that I worked with back then. What was it like? It was an eye-opener that there was so much relapse and that it was so hard to help people with addiction. And you see that still today.
You think it's worse today with all the...
Yes, because the chemicals are worse. You've got fentanyl laced in the heroin, and the addiction is so much easier to happen. And I'm just grateful that I have 2 children, and neither one of them have ever been bitten by the addiction bug.
Yeah, but it's a real thing, and you can see it, and you know.
That friend that I mentioned I lived with when I got out of college,
yes.
His son died of a heroin overdose at age 26 a few years ago.
Yeah.
And this is a very sane guy with a sane family life, and yet...
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with, I mean, you can be the greatest kid, the greatest family, those things happen. It's just...
Yeah. I must be honest, though, one thing I learned after working with addicts for 2 years was that I didn't want to work with addicts.
Yeah.
And I stopped doing that, and I started working with, it may not seem like much of a switch, but it was. I started to work with people who had mental health problems.
And the whole variety of, because there's a spectrum there.
Yeah, I worked with people who were residing at the time in state hospitals.
No, so seriously long-term.
Yes. Yeah, I found them fascinating, and I liked working with them more so than with the addicted personality. And so that's who I've worked with ever since 75. I've worked with people with major mental illness, and a lot of them have major diagnoses or something like PTSD.
And so when you're working in a hospital like that, I mean, I worked in a hospital in a psych ward when I was,
Did you?
Yeah, when I went to, when I was trying to decide if I wanted to go become a doctor, I said, well, I'll work as an orderly. So I worked as an orderly for 4 years, and one of the areas I worked was the psych ward, so I learned a lot about, or at least I saw what that was like.
Where was that?
That was in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Oh, okay.
And, but I never had the opportunity to work with patients that were really long-term in hospital care. That's a whole different variety of human being, right?
Well, my career became part of what is called the Deinstitutionalization Movement.
Yes, I know
which
what that
is taking people out of state hospitals and putting them in small group homes in the community or in their own apartments. And I was really kind of part of the vanguard of that in Massachusetts.
And so when did that happen? When was that time
That
frame?
was happening right around 75.
Yeah, so you were right on the top of that.
I was. And, our one of the first group homes we opened, we had to go to the state Supreme Court to establish our legal right to be in the community. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of opposition and prejudice, and there still is about the mentally ill.
Yeah, I know. Mm. And so during this time, you're working have you started to work towards your PhD?
I started working, I got my master's in 73, and I entered the PhD program at Boston College in 80, and that took 7 years.
Mm-hmm. And what was your PhD in?
In clinical social work, and my dissertation was on self-injury, which is frequently referred to these days as cutting or other forms of being. And basically, I've worked in the area of self-injury and suicide ever since.
And so that was kind of a new field, wasn't it, as far as cutting and that kind of stuff, self-injury? I mean, clearly it's been going on for a long time, but it really hadn't come to the forefront like it is in our society today, right?
Yeah, well, what happened about 15 years ago is self-injury moved from hospitals and group homes and people with severe disturbance, and now, oddly enough, it's commonplace in middle schools, high schools, and universities, in people who are often not very disturbed.
Mm-hmm. Is that more a reaching out for help kind of? What's
well, there's biological explanations now about why self-injury works. And the explanation is that the area of the brain that handles physical pain overlaps considerably with the area of the brain that handles emotional pain. And it turns out when you cut yourself, and you stop cutting and the pain recedes, the brain is tricked and it releases and reduces emotional pain simultaneously. So it actually works physiologically that cutting yourself makes you feel better in terms of emotional pain. It's counterintuitive, but it's true.
No, I can see that. It makes, I mean.
Well, with your medical background.
Yeah. And by the way, this is an art show, but it also is. It's also stuff that I'm interested in.
If anybody's still listening to this who tuned in for the art, it's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, no, it's getting there, folks. I'm telling you, we will get to the Hopi Kachinas. But the thing is of this show is, I want to just learn about the individuals that end up in our profession. So, Barry's the guy who is really considered to be one of the leaders in our field, a specialist in Kachinas. But how does a guy get there? And it's a circuitous route sometimes, and as you can tell, it is. And we're going to find this route, regardless of whether you want to know it or not. We're all going to, because I want to know it.
It was circuitous.
So in the 80s, you finish your dissertation, you get your PhD, and then where do you set up shop?
Oh, I've been working in Worcester, Massachusetts for 40 years, and in the mid to late 70s, I became executive director of this human service agency, this Deinstitutionalization Movement. And I served as executive director of that until 2 years ago, so it was 40 years. And basically, we continued to grow and expand the number of programs in the community and do more and more work specializing in people with self-destructive behavior.
And so how many clinics do you have now? You started with one.
By the time I retired, we had over 50 programs.
Wow.
And I had written 3 books on self-injury and suicide, which is one of the reasons when I started doing more and more in the Indian art world, I could write because I already had writing skills in a totally different arena.
And were these books that you wrote for general public consumption, or were they more clinical for the trade type?
They were clinical books for professionals. They weren't for mom and dad.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about doing something like that?
I have helped other people do that, but I'm a therapist, and I'm more interested in solving clinical therapeutic dilemmas. So when I've written, and I've lectured a lot about that all over the world actually, I prefer to write clinically than self-help kinds of tomes.
It's a different battle.
It is. It's very different, and that's a very necessary, important arena. It's just not one I've done.
Yeah, though you do it in Indian art world.
Do what?
You do write articles that are for the general consumption. They're based on science, they're based on information, but at the same time, you've written many articles for American Indian Art Magazine.
Right.
And so why the difference there? And I can see in your mind you're saying, well, I don't know if they're different, but they seem like...
No, they're very different.
Yeah.
Because I recently finished a book called The Great Tradition of Hopi Kachina Carvers, 1880 to the Present, which will come out next year.
This is your book?
Yeah, Rio Nuevo.
Yeah.
And I found it a great relief from writing clinical scientific stuff because it's... you're not referencing everything with 6 citations and trying to be super scholarly.
Right.
It's really different when you interview Katsina carvers and tell their story.
Right.
And the way I did that was I would interview people, write the bio and their discussion of their work, send it to them, have them edit it, give me permission to use it. So they were very much empowered to make sure what I wrote was accurate and what they wanted to have said about them. And it was totally different kind of writing.
And so that book, tell me the title again.
The Great Tradition of Hopi Kachina Carvers, 1880 to the Present.
So you go from historic, you start at, why 1880 versus,
because that's about when we know
the first
Kachinas can be dated. There are prototypes from way back in Anasazi days, 1200 AD and so on, mostly in stone, but we have examples in the market, in museums that date to about 1880. That's really when it all begins.
And so I always call them Kachinas, but I notice you have a little different take on the pronunciation.
Yeah, the Hopi don't have a ch sound in their language. Their preferred pronunciation is Katsina, plural being Katsinum. So I try to use the Hopi language, which I've also done in the book. Every Katsina identified. It's identified first, if that's how they edit it, let's hope. It's identified first by the Hopi name and then the English translation. So anyway, I try to respect the Hopi language and their preferences.
And how rare are 1880 Kachinas? I mean, I think I might have just seen a couple in my career.
I have one in my inventory right now. I sold one a couple of days ago at the recent show. So I tend to acquire an 1880, 1890 Katsina, maybe 1 to 2 a year. I have lots from the 20s, but you're right, 1880, 1890, they're hard to come by. And when you're able to get one, it's usually a pretty exciting day.
And so maybe, I know we're listening to this and we don't have the pictures of what an 1880 Kachina looks like, but maybe you could kind of just give us a descriptive, what would make an 1880 or even an 1890 Kachina versus a turn of the century 1910 kind of doll.
Well, they're full-figured. They're very simply carved. The paints are mineral vegetal.
And those colors would normally be, would they have started green, or is that more like a 1900, 1910 kind of a time frame?
Yeah, well, oddly enough, there are some oranges, and there are bright blues, copper carbonate, which when first applied is bright blue and very turquoise looking, but it ages to kind of a muddy green, and you can sort of date carving sometimes by the depth of the copper carbonate and how much it's eroded from its original bright blue. But they're very simple carvings. The arms are usually, if delineated, they're part of the trunk. They're not extended in any way.
Belly warmers kind of thing.
That's right. Yep, they're called tummy ache dolls or things like that. They usually were not meant to stand. They were meant to hang on rafters in Hopi homes. So they topple over if you try to stand them up, and if you want to display them in a way that is dignified, you usually have to obtain a professional stand. It's hard to describe them unless you see the pictures, and a lot of it's the patina.
Yeah,
from 100
and wear
years.
too, right?
What's that?
Wear as well.
That's right. They usually have a lot of wear because they've been kicking around somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that for Kachinas, old Kachinas especially, people, you see pieces out there in the world that are supposedly old but aren't, but there really, quite frankly, wasn't that many people at Hopi and not that many carvers and not that many survive. Wouldn't you say that's true?
Well, unlike the Zuni, the Hopi have been prolific in making Katsina really since the 1890s. And there are a lot of them out there.
A lot being how many would you say?
Oh, thousands.
Yeah, well, that's a lot.
I mean,
more than I would have thought.
Old man Tawaquaptewa alone definitely made Katsina in the thousands. And there's a photo of him in my book that I obtained from somebody out of France from the 30s, in which there's about 30 dolls in the background. That he carved. This guy was a prolific carver.
But how about the early ones? I'm really thinking more like the 1880s to say 1910. Those are rare, very rare.
They're very rare, but they're in places like the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Mass, or the Herd, or the Museum of Northern Arizona. If you want to see a bunch of them, you're going to have to gain access to the collections in one of those major southwestern museums. You don't just walk in and see them. Usually you can see a few on display in a broader display of Katsina over 120 years, but there's not a lot of them.
Well, of course, the Herd has, or at least they do have a huge collection of Kachinas that are
exceptional.
That are on exhibit, and I've been going there since as long as I can remember. And I use that. I've got to tell you, when I first was trying to figure out these dolls and how to date them and all that, which is very difficult. I think it's one of the most difficult areas in our business.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I only specialize in Katsina, really, and so I don't compare it to other things like rugs or pottery or whatever.
I can tell you,
I choose not to do that, so it's interesting to hear you say that.
Definitely, it's right up there. And for a couple of reasons. One, anytime you're dealing with wood or stone, those are the easiest things to replicate or make fakes or frauds. And people have been making copies for years. So you have to wager, you're through this amount of pieces that aren't old, but before you can do that, you have to understand what old looks like.
Yeah, there are a lot of fakes, unfortunately, of Katsina, and it's easy to spot them if you have studied them.
Yeah, if you're Barry. If you're Buffalo Barry, it's easy.
Well, it's not just me, but
frankly,
it comes down to the ethnographic details on the carvings and whether the kilt or the face or the costume or the body paint is accurate and something that a real Katsina would have. And the people that make the fakes, they haven't done the homework to add those details correctly. So they leap out to you, if you're a specialist, immediately as pathetic fakes.
Right.
But
wrong colors, wrong kilts, wrong Kachina, even if they've carved it nicely and even tried to make the old wear. Yeah.
that's right.
I see the same thing in like Maynard Dixon drawings.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They'll do a
kidding.
drawing and they'll put it at they'll have a drawing done in, say, Taos, New Mexico, and they'll have it dated in 1940. Well, he wasn't in Taos, New Mexico in 1940. It was 1931.
Okay.
July 1931 to January 32. So
It's all in the details.
it's all in the details.
Which is why people do need to go to knowledgeable dealers, because we've done the homework over the years, and we can save them costly mistakes.
And you guarantee them.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
I mean, just yesterday I was meeting at the show in Albuquerque. I was meeting a young man who's a jeweler, and he asked if he could send me pictures of 2 Katsina he bought for $100 each. He said they look old, and they were both fake.
Yeah.
And he bought them at a flea market, and I said, well, the bad news is these aren't legit, but I said, when I'm in a charitable mood, I call them folk art carvings, but the rest of the time I call them fakes.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said, well, I like the way they look. And I said, fine, but you asked me what they are, and the news isn't good.
Yeah. But so let's go back a little.
Yeah.
So you're working in the mental health field.
Right.
And so when did you started collecting these at about 92, is that?
No.
Or even earlier? You started
Yeah.
getting in the field, I know. You started writing in the field about that time,
Yeah.
right?
Well, there was a link between the two realms of my head, which is I went to a suicide conference in San Diego in '86, something like that. And I went to the Old Town, and I went to a store that sold Indian art, and I bought my first Katsina doll, which turned out to be a Navajo fake. When I
Congratulations.
So a friend of mine calls him.
Hope you still have it.
I don't. I got rid of it. And anyway, a friend of mine calls them tuition payments.
Yeah.
All right, those kind of mistakes. So
Uh-huh.
fair enough. I made a mistake, but I bought something more important along with the fake doll. I bought a book by Barton Wright called "The Complete Guide to Collecting Katsina Dolls." And on the plane back, I read it and became fascinated and said, I want to go to that place. So within 6 months, I'd gone to the reservation, and that would have been '88, and I've been going ever since. So early on, I bought Katsina carvings as a collector, and then, as often happens with us, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to pay full price for these things, and I have some bizarre passion for them that I can't even fully explain. And so I became a dealer, and I would do really naive things early on. I would claim I was a dealer and try to buy one item and expect a discount. And that didn't go over so well with the galleries on Hopi or other places. I eventually learned I had to kind of step up and buy a few if I wanted to have some sort of a dealer discount.
And what do you think that was in '86 that tripped your switch that when you were reading about this? Because there's something clearly that did.
Well, some of it was really basic. I liked the primary colors, but what I really liked was they were spirit beings. And that's what moved me. And as I read about the religion and realized, despite all the aversiveness that Native people had experienced, here was a religious tradition still in place 1,000 years. And they're still doing the dances in the villages.
Yeah,
and
tell us a little bit about that for people who might not know what the Kachinas are all about at Hopi.
Sure. Well, the Katsina religion goes back 1,000 years. And it runs from generally around January through late July. And Katsina has 3 names or connotations. The Hopi believe that Katsina spirits are ineffable and invisible, and that they sponsor the Hopi people. They bring rain, and rain is really important on Hopi because they only get about 9 inches a year. And they also teach the Hopi how to behave and how to interact with each other and what to do and what not to do. And they also facilitate fertility in terms of the Hopi people prospering and having beloved children. So that's the first meaning, the ineffable spirits. The dancers who appear in the underground chambers known as kivas, or in the outdoor plazas during warmer months, the dancers embody the spirits, and the wood carvings represent the dancers. So you have a 3-tiered system of spirits, dancers, and carvings. And what fascinated me about that was the complexity of the religion. And I just, for some unconscious reason, was drawn to the visual appearances of these wood carvings.
And so in those so the dolls that are made,
yes,
who gets the dolls?
Yeah. The Hopi tradition is that all Hopi infants receive one doll, usually Hahaiwuti, the grandmother Katsina. Males only get that one. That's it. And from that afterwards, it dances given out by the very Katsinas themselves who are there providing the performance. After that, only girls get Katsina until they reach puberty. And they're usually given several per year at some of the major ceremonies. But at some point, the Anglos, the anthropologists, or the tourists, or the ethnologists, or whatever, they started to collect them. Because back then the belief was, from Edward Curtis all over the place, it's a dying race. They're all going to be gone. Let's collect these interesting artifacts so we have a record of their past existence. Well, it turned out, thank God, that they were wrong and that the Hopi didn't disappear. But then the Hopi, probably in about the 20s, started making them for sale. And they were indistinguishable in general then from the Katsina that were given to the Hopi girls. But there's not a lot of employment on the Hopi reservation. It became a whole major cottage industry.
In that 20s, starting in about the 20s.
That's what we think.
And were these dolls given by the uncles to the kids, to their nieces?
Well, we don't talk about that.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, because the Katsina spirit, the dancers, they are the Katsina spirits and dancers.
Yes.
And they give them
I get it.
to the children. And I've been trained by the Hopi that the religion isn't for me. I'm what's called a pahana, a white guy.
Yep.
And I try not to ask questions about the religion because I've learned that the Hopi are pretty sensitive about intrusive questions. And
rightly so, by the way.
Exactly, about experts writing about them because people have done things in the past like burst into kivas and ceremonies and confiscate sacred objects and take photographs of ceremonies to the point where all the tourists and photographers were disrupting the ceremonies. So I really try to be respectful. And one aspect of that is being very careful about your language. And I've been trained a lot by Hopi folks and other friends who live out there how to conduct myself in a way that hopefully most of the time is sensitive and respectful.
Yeah, so you're sensitive to the religion, you're sensitive to the people, and you're sensitive to culture, and you enjoy the art that they've made.
I do.
And do they have an issue at all with the Kachinas being sold, do you know? I know they're still carving them, and it's an important part of their industry, actually.
The Zuni appear to. The Hopi, it's been going on for 100 years. Many Hopi make their living selling carvings.
Right.
And once in a while, you'll hear someone take a fairly unusual position objecting to the sale of the Katsina carvings, but frankly, it's very, very rare. And it's not like, for example, Iroquois masks.
Yeah. Right. That's something
I can't speak about that in a knowledgeable way, but those are often considered very sensitive and not to be sold.
Correct. And I know you and I are both in this position that if we have material that we feel even remotely has some kind of a religious or spiritual component, that's not something we want to handle or deal with. That's something for those cultures. That's their cultural patrimony and things that we stay away from. And as you said,
absolutely,
Iroquois masks are one of those areas, and should be.
Right. Absolutely. You've got to be respectful. If you're respectful of the culture and the material, then you have to respect the boundaries that they request.
So you start collecting this stuff. I'm going to get back to how you actually get in here. So you go to San Diego, you buy a fake doll, but it trips a switch. You learn about them, you go to Hopi, and you start making trips yearly to Hopi. And so at what point would you consider yourself not a collector of these dolls, only a collector, because I'm sure you still are collecting them, but also you start dealing in them? What time frame was that?
3 to 4 years.
Yeah. So by 1990, you're starting to buy and sell. And what part of that did you enjoy? Why was that enjoyable?
Well, I started to build a collection, and I was reading voraciously, and I got to know Barton Wright, who was a major expert within the limits of being a white expert. And I started, since I already had writing skills, I started writing articles. So one of the very first things I wrote was I infiltrated a Navajo Kachina factory, and maybe I should explain that the Navajo, they don't believe in Katsina, they believe in yays.
Correct.
But the Navajo since the 50s have made knockoff Kachinas, which they, in the factory that I infiltrated, they were being made in assembly line fashion with one person roughing out the limbs and the next person gluing them together and the next one sticking on horrendous looking rabbit fur.
And were the carvers that were making these Navajo, these are Hopi styles, what we refer to?
Well, yeah.
They were the workers, but did they actually own the place that was making?
Usually not. Usually a white guy.
It's usually a white guy who says, okay, let's get a bunch of Navajo workers that can make it, and then we can say it's Indian made.
That's correct. And they were in Gallup and Grants and places like that. Anyway, he infiltrated the factory and discovered that someone was signing it at the end of the assembly line. Now, what's the objection of Navajo making Katsina? The objection is they don't believe in Katsina.
Right.
They believe in a different religious tradition, which is very legitimate in its own right. And the Hopi objected to the Navajo ripping off their religion and, in a sense, stealing a portion of their business by underselling at much cheaper amounts, because the Hopi Kachina is made by one person, not assembly line fashion, and it's made faithfully in terms of detail of the actual dancers, and the Navajo would streamline and...
they're an assembly plant.
Yeah, that's right. So I wrote an article about that, which was published in a newspaper named Indian Trader, and then it got republished in a Santa Fe daily, weekly journal, I think it was, and the people on Hopi loved it. They pasted it up all over the place to say, look, this is what a Navajo Kachina is. It's a piece of crap. And it was a way that it strengthened my bond with the Hopi people, because they could tell I was on their side.
Right. And how did the Navajos respond to that?
No Navajos ever responded.
No.
However, when I infiltrated the factory, the owner of the factory, a white guy who looked kind of like a biker, he wanted me to write an article on his Kachinas. And I said, oh, that's an interesting request. I'll have to think about that. But I did not do it. Can you tell?
Yeah, well, we see these, we just call them Hopi style. That's what I refer to them. They're not really even that, but it's just, they're the very typical, you can tell that they have them pasted on a base, that they, the arms are put together. It's not one solid piece. They usually have chicken feathers all throughout. And you'll find them commonly at any intersection around Tucson or Albuquerque, selling it, saying Kachinas for sale, 50 bucks and up,
Don't forget the rabbit fur.
Yeah, I forgot about the rabbit fur. And we see lots of these. You probably see more than I, and I see them almost weekly. The people wanting to sell them, and often they'll come in a nice fancy case that's more expensive than the doll itself. Well, I shouldn't even call it a doll, but it's a figure. Now, there is some Navajo carving that does occur in folk art. There's a few.
Oh, it's great stuff.
Some great, wonderful folk art that is in, but it's not about Kachinas. It's about a different sensibility and what they're trying to.
That's right.
Willito is one of those.
And by the way, it's not just trading post or roadside these days. Type in Kachina on eBay and you'll get pages and pages of Navajo dolls.
Yeah. Well, you'll also see them in places like, I've seen them up in Monument Valley and actually in Monument Valley where they're selling them. And so I think you have to be careful. Your average Kachina doll by a real carver from Hopi is going to take months to make. not, hours. And
well, certainly days and weeks, and even if they carve in the traditional style, it's fairly simple. But even so, it takes many hours, and often the paints are mineral and vegetable if they're doing it in the traditional style. And those who carve in the fine art, sculptural, ultra detailed style, those can take weeks and months.
Yeah, and so when you broke that story, how did that change your position as a dealer, or did it?
It did. I wrote another story around the same time called The Emerging Trend of Traditional Hopi Kachina dolls, or old style Kachina dolls. And that was just happening. Manfred Sosunkua had started that tradition back in the 70s. He was someone who worked with Charles Loloma and Lloyd Kivanu and down in Scottsdale. And Manfred decided that something was being lost with the ultra realistic Katsina dolls with the fingernails and the wrinkles on the knees, and he said this wasn't the Katsina doll that I grew up with. They were frightening. They induced awe, and they weren't cute or pretty. So he started doing traditional style dolls, and then there was.
What year would have that been?
He did that in the 70s.
Yeah, that's early.
But then Joseph Day and his wife Janice on Hopi. They were living up there, and they opened up a little trading post called Sakurshabi, which is there to this day and a very successful place indeed. And they started encouraging some of the young carvers to carve in the traditional style, and that happened. And people like Manuel Danette Chavarria and Clark Tanakongva and Spike Satala and many others started doing much more simple dolls that resembled the carvings from the 1880s and 1890s that we were talking about before. And that caught on, but I wrote about it very early in its trajectory, and I interviewed Barton Wright about it, and he said, I don't think this is really going anywhere. And Barton, who was right about a lot of things, was wrong about that. And turned out that all happened in the late 80s, and it's as strong a tradition in Katsina carving on the Hopi Reservation these days as maybe stronger than the fine art, ultra-realistic style.
And do you think part of it, I can clearly see part of it was religiously based, or at least getting back to the roots, but
that's right.
From a standpoint of trying to ship very intricate Kachinas as a gallerist, I can tell you is a nightmare because they have a tendency to break. Do you think any of those kind of pressures, and then just, you could make a simple doll not as time consuming, so it doesn't cost as much. So do you think the economics pressures were as part of this as well?
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. You could sell a doll for $100 or $200 instead of working for 6 weeks on something you have to sell for $3,000, for which there are very few buyers. Now there are some who will spend $10,000 or $20,000 on a Katsina doll, but they're few and far between. Whereas here's a legitimate Hopi craft that you can buy on the reservation when you're visiting, and you're going to pay $150 or $250, and it resembles the Katsina you just saw at a dance. That's a marvelous takeaway. So I think there was an economic side of it. It was more practical, and you could sell them much more successfully, more frequently.
Yeah. If you made a doll, you could get it sold quickly.
That's right.
Yeah, and that makes, I think that runs the current through a lot of native arts, not just the Kachinas, but you see it in jewelry, you see it in rugs, you see it in other things. One of the things that for rugs, and they've gotten smaller and smaller because it's easier to get them sold. I think Mark Winter's done a very nice job of encouraging the weavers that he will pay them for their time and effort that they put in a large one, and want to see these larger pieces done. So do you find that part of the Kachina carving world, where they're doing these very intricate, long time consumption dolls to make is getting smaller?
Well, I haven't studied the market like an economist would. My impression is that the fine art dolls, which really hit a major peak in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, have cooled off a lot. And that a fair number of those carvers who worked in that style have aged. Some of the people in my book are younger examples of that and carve in the fine art style. But the sheer number of people working in the traditional simple style, it's a much larger group. And I think economic forces, as you're saying, have played a role.
And are any younger carvers doing things that are outside the realm of dances? In other words, they're incorporating the skill set, the history of carving, but doing it in a form that might not be called really a Kachina, but is art.
They are. The one who's notable and extremely creative, and I'm very fond of his work, is Mavasta Hanyuti, who comes from the Hanyuti family, which is arguably one of the most accomplished families of Katsina carving, and it goes back 3 generations. And Mavasta, who's also a teacher in Haute-Villa, a town on Third Mesa in Hopi, he teaches middle school kids, but in his spare time, he does extremely creative carving. So I bought from him, for example, a skateboard deck with Boba Fett painted on it, but Boba Fett's wearing Hopi gauntlets on his arms, and he has a rabbit stick, which is a traditional Hopi hunting tool. So you got one of the things Mavasta says he likes to do is comment on pop culture and interweave it with Hopi traditions, and that his students love to see the combinations and what he comes up with. Another example is he did a remake of the famous Abbey Road photograph of the 4 Beatles walking across Abbey Road, but instead it's 4 Katsina heads in suits, all of which are clowns. And he does very, very creative things. That he does straight carvings of Katsina, sometimes in cylindrical forms that are very much a fine art, ultra-realistic style. He does plaques.
And what does he call these objects that are not really, they're clearly not Abbey Roza, clearly not a Kachina? What would he call them? Does he call them?
I think he lets them sort of speak for themselves.
I
so
see.
He'll say, here's some new work.
Yeah.
And I often buy it because I just am amazed by his creativity. He did win Best of Show this year at the Herd Kachina Market.
Nice.
And he's won Best of Show or Best of Category at the Santa Fe Indian Market. So he's had a lot of recognition.
Yeah.
And
I will definitely check him out at Indian Market, which is something, again, this may not air before Indian Market, but we're here in Santa Fe doing this podcast because the great dealers are here, like Barry. And it's the 3rd week in August every year, and I encourage anybody who hasn't been, they should go once in their lifetime. You're going to have hundreds of great native artists you can buy directly from the native artists, and you'll see some innovative stuff. And this is one of these artists clearly who is on the cutting edge of taking carving in the Hopi tradition to a different level and a different...
Another guy, Simmerin Grover, takes the traditional style doll and puts them in unusual postures or gives them unusual expressions. So he takes a traditional style and exaggerates or extends it slightly. So for someone who knows the traditional style and sees a simple linear cylindrical carving that's sort of straight up, kind of like a log of wood with some hands and feet carved into it, he'll do unusual things like extending the arms considerably and doing figures that others wouldn't do. So he's another one who does rather exceptional and very noteworthy variations from the usual theme.
Well, and then if we go back historically, and maybe you could discuss a couple of carvers that people collect, and I've had, and you've had lots. Wilson Tawaquaptewa and Jimmy K. Maybe you could tell people about Wilson and Jimmy.
Sure. Well, Wilson, I've written a lot about. I've written 3 or 4 different articles on him, and he's unique in the history of Katsina carving because he was an important religious leader at the old village of Ariavi, and he believed as a religious leader he shouldn't carve accurate representations of Katsina dolls. So he would lead tours in Ariavi, and the tourists would be shown around the village, and the tour would end at his house where he would have carvings to sell. But what was unique about him was that he made them up or mixed them up. He never did an accurate representation of a Katsina, and now and then someone will send me a photo and says, look, Tawaquaptewa, he did one that was actually a real Katsina, but when you look at it, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Such as the body paint didn't work, or he added a bunch of absurd polka dots, or...
And that was kind of a trademark you would see, are these polka dots. Maybe you could talk about some of the things you see in a
well, polka
Tawaquaptewa
dots are part of it. But the main way you know it's a Tawaquaptewa is you look at it and you say, this is not a Katsina that you find in any book that you've ever seen at a dance. He's made it up. And he's made it up to be true to his religious convictions, which is, I won't sell accurate representations. But sometimes, a lot of times the collector would say, okay, what is this? He'd say, oh, it's a squirrel, it's a bear. Right. He would humor them, and they would think they were going away with an accurate representation of a Katsina, but what they were going away with was a unique piece of Hopi art that has escalated in value ever since.
Yeah, and he is actually one of the more collectible, wouldn't you say, or maybe the collectible?
He's right up there, and he died in 1960. He lived from 1873 to 1960.
Yeah, and those squirrels with the big ears are quite recognizable. And it seems like his feet and his hands, to me, too, have a very distinctive
I agree. Also with paints.
Yeah, and the paint colors and types.
There was a typical hue for many. Once in a while, I have a set right now that have very different colors than he typically presented with. But the real tip-off is he mixed them up or made them up.
And did he ever sign these?
I only saw one thing that he signed, which was a shield. And I believe it's at the Arizona State Museum. He didn't sign things. However, he was literate, mainly because partly he was shipped out to the Sherman Indian School from 1906 to 1909, and Hopi, a guy named Matthew Gilbert, has written about that, how he turned the power, and he was sent there along with a lot of his people, including his family members, to anglicize him and turn him into a good white man.
Yeah.
And instead, he was able to maintain Hopi traditions and rituals and some dances and language among his Hopi people at the Sherman Indian School. As Matthew Gilbert says, he turned the power and maintained Hopi tradition among the very people who were attempting to obliterate it.
My book that just came out in the Charles Bloom series is based on that.
Really?
Yeah, it's called Indian School Days, and that's where it starts. And,
I've got to read that.
And how that affects people. And in Wilson's case, clearly he was able to use it in a way most people couldn't, because for some, there are some that said Indian school was a good thing for them and helped them. I've heard that from Native Americans, but there was another group that really it did not. And I took the position for this novel, again, it's a novel, from that point of view.
It's a very interesting theme, and it came up again and again as I was writing this book on Hopi Kachina carvers, which is a lot of the most successful carvers spent time off res in the service or in Indian schools, as you just referenced. And there was ambivalence. On the one hand, they endured a lot of racism and exclusion. On the other hand, they learned to deal with the Pahana's world, the Anglo's world, which helped them negotiate the art world and the art market. They figured out how to play the game because they'd had a lot of exposure to it. Mm-hmm. And they became resourceful and strategic. And some of the most successful people have lived in both worlds and know how to negotiate both worlds. And I think we're talking about the same thing here.
Yeah. And what about Jimmy Kay? Did he go through that same process? And maybe you could talk a little bit about him and his carving.
Well, Jimmy Kay, he came from Shimobe, I believe. And I have written an article on Jimmy Kay that came out in Plateau Journal from the Museum of Northern Arizona a while ago. What was really notable about Jimmy Kay was he was hired by the Museum of Northern Arizona in the 1930s to be a handyman. Mm-hmm. And he quickly became a major lecturer and demonstrator at the museum. He did scores and scores of lectures for tourists, museum visitors, and he would demonstrate...
In Flagstaff. In
Flagstaff.
Yeah, the Northern Arizona.
Yep. He
Demonstrated
Katsina carving. He would sing Hopi songs. He would discuss Hopi tradition. And then at the urging of Mary Colton, who was the director of the museum's wife, he started to sign Katsina dolls, apparently in about the 1940s.
Early. And how would he sign them? Jimmy K?
J.K.
Just J.K. Okay.
Usually on one foot, sometimes on both foot.
And they had a little dot too, didn't they?
Yep, period after the J and the K.
Yeah, I've seen those.
And he was the first to sign Katsina dolls.
Period.
Yep, and that was controversial at the time because they came from the spirit beings. So how can they be attributed to a human being? And anyway, he did it, and this is, I'm sure, true in many of the media that you know about. People started to indicate their authorship, who the creator was.
Correct.
They moved towards attribution. And he started all that, and shortly after that, many other Katsina carvers started to sign their initials or their names or in some other way through a tag, a tribute that they'd made it.
And is there a way you can describe what one of his dolls would look like, assuming it wasn't signed with the JK?
Yes, when I went through the Museum of Northern Arizona's collection, I found that he only signed, they have over 120 dolls by Jimmy K because he worked there for 30 years. And believe me, he wasn't the handyman for most of it.
Yeah.
And I went through every one of the dolls, and I found that only about 40% were signed.
Interesting.
So I assume from that out on the market, maybe only about 40% are signed. But it's a leap of faith, but probably true.
Yeah.
And the main way you can tell is they were shaped like him. He was only like 5 feet tall. He was burly and a strong barrel-chested guy. And his dolls have the same sort of body type. They have very distinctive paints, hands and feet, which a picture would express, but I can't do justice to.
We may try to get one, at least on the YouTube portion of this, so people can see
Well, that
what
would
it is.
really help.
Yeah.
And also show the JK on the feet.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
So Barry, I think we've already done an hour. See how fast this goes? I told you, this is
Have we really?
Yeah, I think this is right. And so is there anything else you want to add before we close this thing up?
I would.
You feel is important?
First of all, I really appreciate the invitation, and it's an honor to be in your list of presenters. What I'd like to say is the Hopi Kachina religion is alive and well. There was a home dance at the village of Shimobe a couple of weeks ago. There were 120 Katsina dancers, apparently. That's a lot of Katsina.
Yeah, that is.
This is not some...
And these are closed dances.
No.
This was open?
They're mostly open.
Yeah.
The Katsina dances are to benefit mankind,
Nice.
humankind.
We need a lot of them then.
Not just the Hopi. They will occasionally close a specific dance, such as a snake dance, and that's another whole story. But they're almost always open to Pahanas or outsiders. Usually you're expected to stand up on the roof, not down on plaza level, and there are ladders to get up on the roof. But the point is, this is not a nostalgia. This is not a reminiscent art form. It's an active art form based on an active religion. And I guess my main advice would be, if you really want to learn about Katsina carving, go to Hopi, see a Katsina dance, and all of a sudden it will become alive for you as to what a Katsina carving is. Because other than that, it's just sort of abstract.
Because that's exactly what you did. You went out there after you learned about it, you went over there and you educated yourself, and you found it wasn't just reading the books. It was feeling it, sensing it, smelling it, knowing the people. And I think if you can make that contact with the artists and with other individuals, you'll have a much deeper sensibility for the artwork you're collecting.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. So great you came and spent the time, and thank you for being a part of our community. Barry, Buffalo Barry, you can find him on the internet. He's got great dolls, and you can always be assured it's going to be legitimate and authentic. Barry Walsh. So. Yeah, for sure.
I certainly hope so.
If not, you can return it for a full money return. Barry, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. Brought to you by Medicine Man Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, eBooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com.